Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're going to continue our lecture today talking about evolution and Charles Darwin. And what I really wanted to do today is just walk through some of Charles Darwin's his long journey that he took. He went to the Galapagos Island, he went all the way around the world, and just talk about him in a little bit more detail. So thank you so much for making it here today. We'll go ahead and get the ball rolling on this. So, Charles Darwin, this is a picture of him, and a lot of the times when we see a picture of a scientist or Charles Darwin in particular, we always see him as an old man, right? Anytime you think of a scientist, you think of an old white guy with a big, long white beard. He's almost looking like Santa Claus, right? Well, actually, he was a really young man when he took this journey. Right here next to me, you can see the map. This is the journey he took. He was on a ship. He went all across the world looking at animals and different fossils that he could find. So he was a pretty young man when he took that trip, but just as he got older in life and he started to publish a lot of his work, that's when he really got to this level of being famous in a certain sense. And so that's most of the pictures that we see of him today. But what I want y'all to know is that he was actually a young guy, and so you can do science and you can take these trips and start to figure this stuff out about the world at any age. You don't have to be an old man like the guy in this picture. And then if you look at this map over here, yeah, so he went on a ship, and his goal was he wanted to figure out more about the world. Well, what's the best way to figure out more about the world than going and looking at it? So he got on this ship. They went all across the globe there. They were looking at different animals and different fossils that he could find. And this played a really big role in his work, because we know that part of this trip he went to the Galapagos Islands and he looked at those finches, and that really got him thinking about how these animals started to change from one another. So I wanted to show you those two pictures, and we'll go ahead and get into some of the information here. So Charles Darwin is a well-known naturalist, and I wanted to tell you what a naturalist is. So a naturalist is a scientist that studies nature. And so this is why it was so critically important for him to get onto that ship and travel the world, because he wanted to see what is in the world firsthand. At this point, obviously, there's not an internet, so he's not able to just go look them up like we are today. He wanted to see what animals are in the world and see if he could kind of start putting these puzzle pieces together, right? His main idea was that all species of life descended from a common ancestor. And I wanted to remind y'all of a term that we talked about several units ago. I gave y'all a vocabulary word called LUCA, L-U-C-A, and that's an acronym that stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. Charles Darwin and a lot of scientists today think that if you go back far enough, you would find an organism that relates all forms of life today. There was probably one organism, it was using cells to make up its body, and it had DNA in those cells. Those are two things that we see in every living thing today. So scientists think that if you go back far enough, you could probably find this last universal common ancestor, or the first organism that had cells and DNA. And that would be kind of what relates all living things on the earth today together. Okay? He claimed that the branching pattern of evolution resulted from a process he called natural selection. And so his idea is that evolution occurs through this process of natural selection. Natural selection is basically the struggle for existence. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail as we go through this lesson today. But the idea here is that as an organism struggles to exist, to survive, it has to find habitats and water and food, and it has to find a mate so it can reproduce. The organisms that are doing that well are going to be the ones that reproduce more often. And if they're reproducing more often, they're leaving their genes in the gene pool for the next generation. And so by struggling to survive, some organisms are going to be better at it than others. Some organisms will be able to find food when others don't. Well, what traits made that organism able to find the food when the other one was unable to? Whatever it was, because they did find the food and they did survive, they're going to be more likely to reproduce, and they're going to leave those genes behind for the next generation. And then that generation is going to be more like the organism that was able to find food than the one that wasn't. And so through this way, through natural selection, nature's kind of selecting which traits are favorable, and those are the ones that tend to stick around in multiple generations. Okay, so here's some more information about Charles Darwin. So from 1831 to 1836, Charles Darwin set sail on a worldwide voyage on the HMS Beagle. This was the ship that he was on. You'll see HMS in front of a lot of boats and ships, and that stands for His Majesty's ship. So this was some king of England or king in Europe, and he had a ship, and Charles Darwin went on it, and they took that trip across the world, and he wanted to see what was out there. He wanted to see what animals he could find and start to put together his theory of evolution. Okay, Darwin began investigating the geographical distribution of wildlife and fossils he found on his trip. So not only was he looking at the animals in these different locations, but he was also finding fossils. And that's a really important part of this whole story, because some of the fossils he was finding, one really great example of this are these giant sloths in South America. He was finding these fossils and trace fossils of these giant sloths, and those animals aren't around today, or they weren't, and they also were not around when Charles Darwin went to those locations. So the animal wasn't there, but the fossils were. And that told him that, hey, there could have been a point in time when the animal life, the wildlife, was different than it is today. That seems pretty obvious to us today because we know what fossils are and we know what they represent. But at that point, it was a really new idea, and it played a big role in his whole theory that, hey, life can change over time, right? He's finding these fossils of these giant sloths that were alive hundreds to thousands of years ago, but they're not around today. And so that tells him that, hey, sometimes animals don't make it and they go extinct, and that kind of got this whole process started, right? So after years of research, he and a different scientist, this scientist's name is Alfred Russel Wallace, they both submitted work to the society in London, this scientific society in London. And they both kind of had the same idea that these organisms can change over time. And what Charles Darwin called it was evolution by natural selection. Alfred Russel Wallace is really known for something else. We know today that all the continents used to be put together in that supercontinent called Pangaea, and over time the tectonic plates have kind of shifted. That's really more of what he is known for, but he played a big role in Charles Darwin figuring out about the theory of evolution too. So Darwin's work established evolutionary descent with modification as the dominant scientific explanation of natural diversification. So what's going on here is that, like I said, if you go back far enough, you would be able to find that LUCA, that last universal common ancestor that ties all living things today. Well, as that organism spreads across the world, it has to change to better fit its environment, just like Darwin's finches were. Their beaks were all a little bit different because they were eating different food. Well, because they're changing just a little bit over long periods of time, that's how we're able to see eventually those changes start to accumulate. And that's how you can get organisms that are vastly different from one another, but that share a common ancestor if you go back far enough. So, great work on that. Okay, here's the last thing I wanted to talk about. This is a very famous work. This is what Charles Darwin, he took all of his ideas and he wrote a book, and the book is called On the Origin of Species. So Darwin published his theory of evolution with compelling evidence in his 1859 book, On the Origin of Species. Really try to remember the name of that title. Okay, by the 1870s, the scientific community and a majority of the public had accepted evolution as a fact. He had a lot of evidence that supported it, and he was able to show that there's a lot of strong evidence that supports this idea. Darwin's scientific discovery is the unifying theory of the life sciences, explaining the diversity of life. So Charles Darwin, he took this trip around the world. He's cataloging all the amazing animals and wildlife and fossils that he's finding. He comes back home, he takes years and years and just thinks about it and looks over his notes and all the research that he's done. He eventually compiles all of that work into this book on the origin of species. He publishes it, and it's so compelling and has so much evidence in it that a lot of people accept that, hey, this explains what we're seeing in the world. And it's a great explanation of what is going on. And a lot of people thought that it was accurate, and so they kind of bought into it. And Charles Darwin, his theory of evolution really ties together a lot of the life sciences because it explains why we see so many different organisms on the planet today. So your teacher has some other work for you to do. Make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.